Hello BookTube, I'm Heather and this is Recently Seen Reading, and I have a weekly reading update for you. I have 3 books I think I've finished and several that are on the go. I'll probably not talk about everything that's scattered in this room. The first thing I want to talk about is Simone de Beauvoir's The Mandarins. Now I'm reading this with a group of people organized by Sarah of Hardcover Hearts, and our next check-in is on Sunday. And I have finished this. I don't want to talk about it in detail, but I do want to kind of offer a couple of thoughts about what it's like to read this novel. And for me, this was a reread. So I read this one 2.5, maybe 3 years ago, and this is a reread. And I'm reading it in English. Beauvoir wrote this in French and published it in 1954, and then it appeared in English in 56, I think. So I'm reading a 1956 copy, and there's no translator identified on it. I think there are 2 kind of points of friction in reading this novel, friction in the sense of things that make it more challenging to read than it would have been for an audience in the 1950s or 1960s. The first is Beauvoir's status as a feminist. So this came out after the publication of The Second Sex, and if you read it, either being familiar with The Second Sex or having read The Second Sex, it's likely to be a frustrating experience if you go into it with the hope that Beauvoir is going to be writing a feminist novel. There's certainly elements of this that could be looked at through a feminist lens, but if you're expecting it to be a positive, perfect reflection of idealized women, not so much. It's not that kind of novel, and that can be a point of frustration for people, or a point of disappointment in Beauvoir. The second hurdle, I think, in reading this novel is how fixed in its time it is. So it was written in 54, published in 54, but it was written from about probably 48, 47 to 53. And it's a novel about the French reaction post-war. So the novel starts in December of 44, which is 3-4 months after the liberation of Paris. And it's a novel that's grappling with the consequences of the Second World War, both on individuals and on the French polity. And I think that makes it challenging to read now, because most of us, especially in an Anglophone world, aren't as familiar with French history and French politics of the 40s and 50s as the novel demands. This won the Prix Goncourt. It was very popular and important in its time, but our distance from the events of that period make it sometimes a challenging novel to read. Both times I've read it, I've had to go back to Wikipedia or a historical text to understand the politics behind the novel, because Beauvoir is exploring the consequences in terms of both the impact on intellectuals and politicians of the period. And she's kind of grappling with what do you do about collaboration? What counted as collaboration during the war? What should the consequences of collaboration be, both on a personal and a political level? What is the role of an intellectual after the end of the Second World War and the more public understanding of the concentration camps and the dropping of the atomic bomb? And what do we do or think about the changing dynamics, power dynamics between the influence of the United States and the influence of the Soviet Union just before the Cold War ramps up in earnest, and well before Khrushchev's revelations about Stalin. So I think that makes this a challenging novel to read. I think if you're interested in Beauvoir as a writer and a thinker, or interested in mid-20th century fiction, it's worth the time you'll invest in it, but it's likely to be a frustrating read in parts. What else do I have here? I gotta shuffle some things. I think I talked about this one last week. This is Transit by Anna Seghars, who is Beauvoir's contemporary. Seghars is a German woman from a Jewish family who left Germany in the 40s and 30s and eventually made her way, basically escaped from Europe through unoccupied France, and she would have left around 41 and went to Mexico. In 42 it became pretty much impossible for people to exit France. So she wrote this while she was living in Mexico. She wrote it in German, but it was first published in 1944 in English. It was also published, I think, in Spanish. It was well until after the war before it was published in German, and for many years it wasn't available in West Germany. So this is a story of an unnamed narrator who is following the same kind of path that Seghars took. He, however, was incarcerated in an internment camp because of some unclear reasons, but largely political reasons. And he and several of his campmates escape and have traveled from the north of Germany down through Paris, and then from Paris, and then the mass exodus when German troops rolled into Paris down to the south of France. Yeah, he doesn't stay with the people he's traveling with. They all disperse. It's a novel about in many ways, about the difficulty of leaving at that time. The narrator is actually a little bit ambiguous about whether he wants to leave or whether he wants to stay. He goes through the mechanics and the very repetitive process of trying to get travel permits, residence permits, transit permits, exit permits, more and more paperwork, piled on paperwork. And he's traveling or using someone else's identity documents, which kind of complicates things and simplifies things, because the person's documents he's using has better chances of getting out. It's an interesting novel. So I read this in translation. Who translated this? Margot Dembo. What I noticed about this one is how kind of repetitive the structure is, and it's kind of, I think, well, most definitely is part of a deliberate part of the construction of the book. Seghars is interested in the kind of demoralizing nature of the repetition and the impossibility of moving forward when you are waiting in Marseille to somehow get out of France to the next place, and then from there on to the next place where you eventually might be able to transit to a safer place. And she attaches this story to a little bit of a romance plot. It's got a couple of twists in it. It's not a strong romance plot. But the characters the narrator interacts, they repeat over and over again. So characters reappear, but they're not necessarily fully fleshed out characters. They're all temporary figures in his life, which makes sense, right? Since it's a novel about migration out of France at a very difficult time. It reminded me a little bit of other stories I've read about the difficulties of traveling from occupied to unoccupied France in the period. Sweet Française, I think, is the one that reminded me of the most, but it's not as tightly focused on the day-to-day experience of that flight from Paris. So I finished that one. What else did I finish? Oh yes, this one. This is a really beaten up copy of The Blind Assassin. This is Margaret Atwood's 2000 novel, and it actually won the Booker, and it's a bit of a chunker. It's over 500 pages, and it's the story of Iris and her sister Laura, who are the daughters of an Ontario industrialist. So their first daughter's born in 1916, and the second daughter's born in 2021. So part of the novel is firmly in Robertson Davies territory. The old families connected to, if not lumbering, small-scale and increasingly more successful manufacturing. So it traces the lives of Laura and Iris from the time that they're born till the time they die. And you know from the very early pages of the novel that Laura dies in 1945 when she's 25-ish, but Iris continues on. And it's kind of the story of relationships and marriages and thwarted lives. It's a novel that really leans heavily on description of services. So women's clothing, plants, houses, the built environment, that kind of thing. And it's very typical Atwood in that there'll be a sentence with a sting at the end of it. And it's, I think, actually not as well written as you might expect for a Booker winner. I think this is actually not a particularly good novel. I think it appeals to people because it's got stories within stories. There's, the story that Iris is telling on the surface. There's a story that's being purportedly written by Laura in the past, in which a male character is telling a female character a very pulpy-based, science fiction-y based story in Scheherazade fashion. So these novels are stories within stories within stories. And as you progress through all of the stories, various things are revealed or not revealed, and things echo amongst the stories. And that can be a very appealing structure for writers and for readers. I can see why this novel would appeal, but it annoyed me. It just annoyed me over and over again. And the annoyance comes down, I think, to this over-reliance on description of surface and under-description of characters. Now this is a challenge when you have a first-person narrator, how you get insight into the people they're describing, who they don't necessarily like. But the villains in this novel, and there are of course villains, they're very flat characters. Their villainy is very obvious and described in a very obvious way. I mean, they might as well have mustaches and twirl them and wear top hats. It's not, I think, a very strong novel. Me and Atwood, we don't get along in her prose. I think this is kind of standard mid-career Atwood. Many readers like and love this novel. I'm not in that group, unfortunately. But I'm glad I did it. I'm glad I finished it. Would I reread it? No. Would I recommend it to anybody? Only if you're an Atwood completist, or if you're really interested in how novelists manage narratives that kind of are layered. Also, if you're very interested in how Atwood would describe period costume, this might be of interest, but it's not for me. Not for me. I don't think it's particularly good. So that's what I have finished. Let me just shuffle some things. What have I got for the next week to read? I have started Mavis Gallant's Montreal Standard Time, which I got via NetGalley. I'm really loving this. They're all short pieces of prose she published in the newspaper, so they're occasional pieces, but they're quite good for a woman in her 20s doing journeyman prose at a newspaper. So I've got about halfway through that, and I think this one is likely to be something that I would recommend if you can get it, especially if you can borrow it from a library. My library, my public library here, the staff there are on strike. This is the tail end of week 3 of the strike, which really puts a crimp in my reading plans. So that means I don't have access to new releases. There's no access to any physical presence of the library. Ebooks are still available, but I'm not crossing that picket line. I have a mental picket line across digital access to the various ebooks and services the library offers. The folks who are striking for a very good reason. The staff are largely part-time. It's impossible to put together a full-time wage, working part-time shifts in the system. The people working in the system have been underpaid for many years, and they are underpaid compared to other people working similar jobs in the city. And the differences are quite apparent once you start to look at the wage breakdown, so that a courier for the city moving documents and boxes from one place to another place for the city earns about $2 more than the person who moves books from one part to the other part of the system for the library. And there's no reason for that beyond the history of underpaying library staff. Someone who is schlepping boxes of books from one branch to another branch, a critical service for the library, does not do work that is of lesser value than the courier who works for the city. It makes no sense, and the wages across the board are all like that. The staff are all paid anywhere from $2 to $5 less per hour than their city counterparts. So there's a good reason for it. The library board, I can think, is trying, but yeah, they're on strike, and they'll probably be on strike maybe through next week as well. I know they're meeting this week to see if they can get any further on a negotiation. And I wish the strikers well, but man, I miss going to the library, and I'm looking forward to being able to borrow ebooks again and print books again. So given that, I've got the one thing from NetGalley I'm going to get through. I have, for light reading, I don't think this is actually going to try to be very light, this is an obscure novel printed by Virago Crime. The Lost Time Cafe by Elizabeth Wilson. This sounds wild. It's kind of a murder mystery set in communist family structures and dynamics. I think this is going to be mediocre to bad, but I think I'm going to enjoy the process of reading this. It doesn't make any sense, the plot, as outlined in the blurb, but I've had it on my shelf for a couple of years. Oh, more than a couple of years. This cost me $2 at the book sale. The other one I think I'm going to try to dip back into is the second volume of Doris Lessing's Martha Quest series. So this is A Proper Marriage, and I started this months ago, so I'll probably have to go back and reread it because what's on here, page 56. So I have a series of book sets that I'm trying to read through, so novel sequences. So things like the Martha Quest series from Doris Lessing, Dorothy Richardson's series, and A.S. Byatt's series. All three of these things I've gotten partway into the first volume or completed the first volume, but I'm not making fast headway. So I'm going to use the library strike as something to motivate me to make a little more progress in these. The Martha Quest sequence of novels, it's a 5-volume sequence, is thought to be fairly autobiographical and traces a character named Martha Quest through her childhood and adolescence, marriage, child rearing, and I think movement from Rhodesia or South Africa to England. So this is Lessing's life path as well. So this is a kind of a very tiny print. I think this is probably a banged up or rebound Panther paperback, so this would have been a paperback that was falling apart and was rebound. So I'm hoping to make headway on this. I think we're about 2 months or a month into Martha Quest's marriage. She marries at 17, 16, and things are starting to go badly, as they do often in Lessing novels when a woman gets married. That is what I have on the books for this week coming up. So 3 books that I read, one which I think is quite interesting, Transit, another one that's interesting but likely to frustrate people, the Beauvoir, the Atwood, which many people love but I don't, and coming up I'm going to finish, I think, the Gallant occasional pieces, which I think is going to be fabulous, start this wacky crime novel set in the communist family, and try and make some headway on the Lessing. I hope you are having a great week and you have a good reading week, and I'll talk to you later. Bye bye.